Okay, so you basically chain these things together. Now, the way that Piaget, he thought, well, what's the motivation for doing this? So the motivation essentially is that, well, sometimes it can be sort of random. You accidentally do something interesting and then try to repeat it. But as you sort of develop, the number of times that you do something accidentally that results in something interesting starts to decline. Now, part of what happens to you as you mature is that the opportunities that are provided for you by your body as you exercise and develop it start to really ramp up and develop, so that you can do a lot more interesting things with your body by the time you're 2 than you can when you're 9 months old. For example, you can zoom around, which just opens up a whole universe of things to pull over and dump over and pull off tables, and and there's things lying around that you can write on walls with, and you can pull out cupboards, and it's like it's paradise for an exploratory baby. So, but what happens is that as the child puts himself or herself together physically and develops additional skills, then they can elicit additional manifestations of novelty from the world. So for example, well, here's a good example. So the child finally manages to get itself upright, which is like a colossal, amazing accomplishment. I mean, first of all, that's hard to do, Like, no, there aren't two-legged creatures in the world except for us, And we're so good at this, you can even... Isn't that wonderful? I learned that when I was 2. So, you can do these amazing things with your body, but the child is like trying to put itself together neurologically, and it's a hell of an operation to get this column of bone. It's like jellyfish on a bone, or on stacked bones, and you've got to get the thing to stand up upright. God, ridiculously difficult. So the child manages that. There's a lot of pain and anguish associated with that, right? Because those little creatures, they just fall down. They've got these little short arms, so they're not much good at protecting themselves from impact. They're just bouncing off the walls like mad in the floor when they're trying to learn to walk. Then they finally get themselves upright and totter along and fall and so on. But then, then the world turns into a different place, because all of a sudden now you can stand up underneath a table. That's a fun thing to do for the first time. It's like, whack! So now your new body has taught you something about the world that you did not know. So what Piaget would say is, well, you've got this scheme worked out, which is the standing up scheme. And it turns out that works pretty well if you're in an empty space. But if you're in an enclosed space with a low ceiling, the whole standing up thing is just not going to produce the results intended. So you stand up and whack yourself, and that's a sign that it's time to update your representational structures. And so you can think of that technically as the emergence of anomaly into what would have otherwise been a conceptually protected space. Now, Piaget has this idea of equilibration. So let's say your baby crawls. And let's say it's an equilibrated crawler, which means it's kind of an expert. And babies get to pretty expert crawlers by about, say, 12, 13 months. They can zoom around. And they know how not to bump into things and how to crawl around without hurting themselves. So when they crawl around, only the things that they want to have happen, most of the time. And they're equilibrated at that point, because their actions and their conceptions of the consequence of those actions match. They've got no problem. What they expect or want to have happen when they crawl is what happens. That baby's has mastered a developmental stage. So that's the stage idea. And that's the equilibrated stage idea. Equilibration is a brilliant idea, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But then all of a sudden the baby learns to stand up. It's like, uh-oh. An advance, but it's like a revolutionary advance. Right? It's equivalent to a revolution in science, which is why Piaget mentioned Kuhn. It's like, well, now I'm a standing creature. The whole crawling expertise is hardly worth it at all. There's some transfer of knowledge, but the new universe that's made accessible to the baby by its now dawning ability to stand forces it to revolutionize its entire cognitive structure. Now, I want to tell you a very quick story because it's a very good one. So, And this is a good indication of the function of dream and play. So when my daughter was 3, she couldn't talk very well. She learned to speak late. And we lived in Boston, and when she learned to speak, she developed a Boston accent, which we were completely flabbergasted by, because we didn't have a Boston accent, and neither did any of our neighbors. Turns out there's a speech impediment that sounds just like a Boston accent. But anyways, she was, it usually goes away, except in Boston. Yeah. So anyway, she was 3, and when her brother was born, there's always the possibility of sibling rivalry, right? Because, and for good reason, it's like, time to get rid of that thing. All it's doing is taking up all of Mom's attention, you know? Like, that's a hard reality for a child who's under 3 to manage, because they're still pretty dependent, and it's like, well, why should they be liking this horrible, noisy, attention-grabbing interloper? So we tried to teach her right from the time he came home, her brother, that the idea was she was going to lose something, which was some parental attention, especially from her mother, but she was potentially going to gain something, which was maturity, independence, and the possibility of a new relationship. Now, we couldn't tell her that. Some parents will tell their 3-year-olds that. It's like, and your 3-year-old has learned to look at you when you talk, but they're actually hearing, you know how dogs in cartoons hear people talk? It's like wah, 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 wah. That's how children hear you talk when you're talking about something like independence. Like, what the hell do they know about that? That's way up there on the hierarchy. But we tried to teach her to interact with the baby in such a way that she would elicit positive feedback from him, and so that they could be friends. And then we also taught her that she should take care of the baby, and that gave her something to do. So that worked. We also didn't let them tease each other. Not much. You know, they're going to tease each other a bit, because siblings often bloody well hate each other when they're young. And sometimes that just destroys the relationship for their whole life. It's like, you don't want that, because you're stuck with your damn brother till he dies, hopefully, or until you do. So, anyway, so my daughter was taking care of this little guy, and, you know, she used to watch him on the steps and sort of shepherd him around, and she was pretty good at it. And then one day he started to walk, and she kept talking about her baby, and we told her that, well, he wasn't really a baby anymore. And we didn't realize that this was setting off a cognitive revolution of the Piagetian sort, because, of course, she'd kind of grown attached to this baby, just like mothers do. And mothers sometimes get so attached to their babies that they really don't want them to stop being babies, and so they end up living in their house till they're 55, you know, plotting the destruction of the world. So you don't want to have that happen. So, but it was happening in a microwave with her. It's like, well, there's this baby, and I spent a lot of time getting used to it, and figuring out what to do with it. And now it's not a baby anymore. What the hell is it? So she had this amazing dream, and it ties back to the shamanic stuff that I taught you guys about earlier. So this is the dream. She dreamt that the baby crawled into a hole in the backyard. Now, the way the hole got there was that a tree from the park beside us had moved into our backyard, and then it had burned down and left this hole. And then the hole was full of water. And so the baby crawled into the water, and it reduced him to a skeleton, and then there was a bug in the water, and the bug pulled him out, and when he came out, he was a new creature. So it was perfect. Like, she came and told me that, I don't know, like 2 in the morning, in her little 3-year-old voice, and I got it all typed down. It was absolutely spectacular, because it was a straight shamanic dream. Like, the tree burned down, and so that's a transformation motif, and then water is the place of rebirth, and, you know, the kid was dissolved into a skeleton, and the little bug that pulled him out is like a representation of the underlying process that guides transformation. Her little brain was like working like mad trying to figure out continuity over change. That's a tough one, right? Because it's almost like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon. It's a big deal. Baby to toddler, that's a big difference. And, you know, she's supposed to figure out, well, that's the same thing. Well, no, it's not. So underneath her unconscious mind, you know, 3-year-olds are not stupid, even though they can't talk. They've got this brain that's like 3.5 billion years old. It's not stupid. So anyways, now why was I telling you that? There was a specific reason. Oh, well, it's another indication of how, so the transformations of cognitive structure are forced upon a child, at least in part by the development of increasing physical ability, right? Because as you increase in physical ability and capacity, then the world transforms, and then your cognitive processes have to transform to keep up with that, and sometimes that's a radical transformation. So Piaget's fundamental hypothesis is that part of the reason that people are motivated to undergo cognitive transformations and learning per se is because as they mature, they automatically come into contact with anomalous information. Information that they cannot process from within the confines of their current world model. And because they can't process it, it interferes with them getting what they want. And so they're motivated to keep their cognitive structures updated. So and sometimes the revolutions occur at a micro level, and that might be like when you're learning the difference between this and this. You know, it's like, it's a major difference, but it doesn't, you know, disrupt the whole fabric of your conceptual universe. Whereas a divorce might, the baby transforming into a toddler might, puberty does. It's because like you just finally got used to your body. You're 12 years old, eh? So you're sort of at the pinnacle of childhood. You're like an adult child. You know what you're doing. And 11 and 12-year-olds are often lovely creatures because they're pretty mature and they've got their act together. And then all of a sudden, bang, sex hormones kick in. It's like, you are no longer the same thing. And neither is anyone you interact with. And so it's like turbulence for 3, 4, 5, 20, 30 years until you sort of sort that out, which you never really do. And so you can see how the physiological transformations that are attendant on development, some biologically predicated and some an emergent consequence of learning, disrupt the cognitive structures that people use to orient themselves in the world, and that some of those disruptions are sort of low-key, equivalent to normal science, and that would be assimilation, and some of them much broader, and that's equivalent to accommodation. Assimilation means you learn something new that you can already handle using the constructs and schemas that you have at hand. You know, so maybe you have to pick the thing up like this instead of like this, but you already know this and you know that, so who cares? It's like a little minor alteration. And sometimes, well, no, you have to readapt your whole body in order to handle the next level of complex problem solving. Learning to drive is like that. Learning to ride a bicycle is like that. And you can see that there's sort of there's not really normal versus revolutionary transformations. There's sort of a continuum that map themselves onto that hierarchy I showed you. You know, so if at the very highest levels of resolution it's minor transformations, and up the higher levels of abstraction you can blow out whole huge chunks of yourself. So it's a continuum. But Piaget and Kuhn sort of conceptualized it as a dichotomy. All right.